so nervous, I didn't even remember his name, but I recognized him as the man who had been interviewed a few days earlier on the 50-50 Club. What he said to me that day after the races stayed with me for now 61 years. And I quote, "I've been coming to the fair races most of my life, and today was the first race I have seen." The gentleman, since birth, had been blind. Those few words did more to shape my career than anything else could possibly do. This year, 61 years later, at Delaware on Jug Day, a similar instance took place. Mike Tanner, Executive Director of the United States Trotting Association, wrote about it in the November issue of Hoofbeats. I'd like to read just a portion of that article. "You don't know Chuck Atkins, who's been in radio for 45 years. The past 40 at Voice Corps, an amazing organization that records and broadcasts the written word to the visually disabled and impaired throughout central Ohio. Chuck, who has been blind since birth, works as an audio engineer, manning the control board and doing the occasional on-air report and voiceovers. I met him in 2018 when I started there as a volunteer reader. When he found out that I worked in harness racing, he wanted to know one thing. Do you know Roger Houston? Turns out that Chuck is a huge sports fan, an exacting connoisseur of sports announcers in particular. When he was 13 years old, in 1968, he stumbled upon the radio broadcast of the Little Brown Jug. He was mesmerized by the passion and cadence of the race caller, Roger Houston's first jug. Chuck went on to say, "I ran around the house for weeks imitating him. I probably drove my parents crazy doing it, but I just thought that he was so good, so distinct. He reminded me of Clem McCarthy and his Kentucky Derby calls. It was like you were there. You could just feel the excitement." Chuck would go on to graduate from the Ohio State School for the Blind in 1972, work for a number of radio stations in the Columbus area, get married and start a family. He's one of the most relentlessly positive, inspiring people I've ever met. Later in the article, "And so it came to be that on Jug Day, I found myself walking across the racetrack toward the infield with Chuck and his good friend Doug Johnson, also a reader at Voice Corps. It's funny the things we take for granted or overlook. Chuck was positively amazed that we were walking on the actual track where the jug takes place. He said, you know, it's firmer than I imagined it would be. And I didn't realize that it was that much higher on the outside than along the inside. Oddly enough, until then, I hadn't thought about it either. I escorted Chuck and Doug up to Roger's station and told them that I would come back after the race was over. Roger and Chuck talked and traded stories. And then Roger called the fourth race. As soon as the field hit the finish line, I made my way back upstairs. And Chuck had the biggest smile he'd ever seen. A few days after the jug, Mike Tanner said, I got a personal note, and I quote, "All I can say is thanks. You have no idea how happy Thursday made me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a little kid again. I know it seems like such a small thing in comparison, but all I can say is a great big thanks. Thank you, thank you, thank you." Those two instances, 61 years apart, but it defined what I am as far as a race car, I guess. My career has been the greatest career that anybody could ever want. I've never worked a single day in my life announcing races because I love it. Well, I did work sometimes. I had a paper route, carried out groceries, did play-by-play football, basketball, and baseball for a local radio station while I was going to college. Wilmington College, just 18 miles down the road from Xenia, Ohio. My Uncle Don called races at Lebanon Raceway from 1953 to 2006, 53 years. He retired at the age of 80. In the years of 53 through 60, when I should have been studying the books, I probably went to Lebanon Raceway 4 of the 5 nights a week. Listen to Uncle Don. Occasionally would do a post parade when he had to go to the bathroom or something like that, but never called a race. I was a senior in high school in 1960. We went to a matinee race program in Wilmington, Ohio, and after the second race, I was paged to the judges' stand. Don had to make one of those trips to the restroom, and he wanted me to do the third race post-parade. He didn't return until after the last race. On a scale of 1 to 10, I may have started at a 3 or a 4, and maybe got to a 7 or an 8 at the end of the day. But the result was jobs at county fairs in Lebanon, Urbana, Hamilton, London, and Marietta, Ohio. The number of fairs grew to 17 by 1965 when I graduated from Wilmington, thinking that I'd be a school teacher and announce horse races in the summer. The day I got my degree, I got a phone call from Phil Mulger, the announcer at Lexington's Red Mile. He had to go to Toledo Raceway to open their season and needed a replacement in Kentucky for 1 week. The only problem was that the owner of the radio station wouldn't give me the week off. Said you gotta work your normal shift. So for 5 straight days, I worked at the station from 6 a.m. to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Grabbed a few hours sleep, got in the car, drove 147 miles, announced 9 races, drove back to Xenia, another 147 miles, get a few hours sleep, and started all over the next day at 6 a.m. However, by 1967, your entire life can change in a very short period of time. And I think it's unbelievable what I'm about to tell you occurred in, I think, a 10 or 11 day period. Got a call at the radio station from Dick Wilson, general manager of Pompano Park, the winter showcase of harness racing. He wanted to know my schedule for the next few weeks. 3 days later, he arrived at the Greene County Fair in Xenia, Ohio. We spoke for less than a minute, and he went to sit in the grandstand. Listen to my audition race. A field of 12, yes, they raced 12 on a half-mile track back in those days. Trotters. Non-winners of $200 lifetime. Also eligible 2-year-olds. Great horse race. 11 of the 12 made breaks. And the winner wins by 20 lengths in a speedy time of 2:17. I looked at the grandstand and Dick Wilson had left. Why couldn't he have shown up the next night when it was a 3-year-old colt pace? That Saturday, I got a telegram saying the job was mine to be the announcer at Pompano Park and the spring and fall meet at the Lexington Red Mile. That same night, my phone rings at 10 o'clock. The gentleman said, "I doubt that you know who I am, but my name is Hank Thompson of the Little Brown Jug." I knew who Hank Thompson was because I'd been going to the jug since 1958 as a youngster. Hank had been, and this is kind of apropos as well, Hank had been at the Adios at the Meadows and was told that afternoon by his announcer, Charlie Hinkle, that Hinkle would not be able to call the jug that year as he was moving to California to call basketball in the newly formed ABA for Pat Boone, the owner of the team in Los Angeles. Hank was without an announcer for the jug in just a mere 4 weeks. Corwin Nixon, the president of the United States Trotting Association, told him that get a hold of that Houston kid in Xenia. When Hank got home, and in those days, he called the operator in Xenia, Ohio, and says, "How many Houstons have you got?" The operator said, 7. Well, he says, "Let's go in alphabetical order." Now, here's another little twist. The first name was Cecil. The second name was Don, my uncle. He calls Cecil. "Oh, you mean my son, Roger." Well, I don't know his first name, but Corwin Nixon said some young kid in Xenia. So Dad gave him my number. Thank goodness my parents named their firstborn Cecil instead of Don. Otherwise, my uncle would probably been calling the Little Brown Jug. So I got the jug. I never will forget that night. My wife at the time, Norma, said, "How much they paying you?" That's a normal wife. I said, "I don't know, and I don't care." In '76, I gave up the job at Pompano, Lexington, and almost all of my Ohio fairs to take the job at Del Miller's Meadows south of Pittsburgh. And after 44 years, I did not retire. That's what the track wanted to put on it. I resigned my position to accept an offer with the Ohio Harness Horsemen's Association as their brand ambassador. Announcing wise, I will Well, I've been doing about 2,500 races a year. Now I'll do about 500. I've already done 18 this year. Plus I'll be substituting at Hollywood, Dayton, Miami Valley, Scioto Downs, and Northfield. Continue to announce my Ohio fairs that I have and make the trip to Dublin, Ireland for the 7th straight year to call the Vincent Delaney Memorial. My race totals have climbed a bit since you got that release. It's at 188,612. Now 145 different venues, 19 states, 8 countries, including the United States, Canada, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Australia, Wales, and Ireland. I still haven't worked a day in my life. A lot of things have happened over the years. I'll talk more about some of the big races later on tonight, but one thing that really sticks out in my mind was at Madison County Fair in London, Ohio. There was a trotter by the name of Ray Barnes who had been thrown out at Lebanon and Hamilton raceways for tearing up the paddock, so he had to race at the fairs. And his trainer driver was a young kid in Ohio by the name of Cliff Albertson Jr. That time London did not have an outside fence. And Ray Barnes was on top by about 3 lengths going down the backside and was a sure winner. But he didn't go left at the 3/4 pole, he went straight into a cornfield. Winner of the race eventually came back and got the picture taken. And about 5 minutes after the race, here comes Ray Barnes and Cliff Albertson, corn stalks all over the race bike, under Cliff's arm. He's whipping. They didn't have a whipping rule in 1960. So, I mean, he's really laying into this horse and yelling, "You!" Well, I won't use those words. All the way down the stretch. Alan Finkelson was a great promoter in harness racing, and he would come up with some of the great promotions in the business. Elephant races, camel races, you name it. But his biggest fiasco was during the quarter horse meet at Pompano Park, when he decided to have a race with a quarter horse in post 1 out of the starting gate and a motorcycle in post 10 out of the starting gate. Now, a quarter horse goes 0 to 75 miles an hour in the first 5 strides and then gets slower from then on. So the quarter horse right out of the gate is on top, and about halfway to the finish wire, there's going to race about 1/8 of a mile. The guy on the motorcycle, quarter horse jumped over the rail and went into the infield. Luckily, nobody got hurt. One of the funniest races at the Meadows, in a race that I laughed the entire final half. There was a couple from Lockburn, Ohio. I think they owned a motel right down the road from Scioto Downs, if I remember correctly. And they had a horse named Mr. Rogers. And of course, if you're from Pittsburgh and watched much television, you know he was named after Mr. Rogers, television fame. They raced him, I think, Richard Myers. No, not Myers.
David.
Who?
David Myers.
David. He had the horse. Brought him to the Meadows where he's racing week in and week out. And one day, he got into a race with another horse. Now, at this point in my career, I really don't memorize the horses before a race. I go through the post-parade and don't worry about them. But familiarize yourself with the name, because you never put two and two together. Going to the half, I said, and it's Mr. Rogers chasing silk panties. Started laughing. As soon as I quit laughing, I'd say something and start laughing again. The last 3/8 of a mile, I think I did more laughing than anything. Then there's the quarter horses. I was doing quarter horses at Pompano Park. And those cowboys out in Oklahoma and Texas and out west, the American Quarter Horse Association is not as strict as the USTA on the naming of horses. And they'd have such great names. One that stuck out in my mind was Poco W. Miss Priss. Poco W. Miss Priss. Poco W. Miss Priss. I can say it plenty of times, no problem. Never really had a problem with it. But then it sounded kind of funny, and some people didn't know what I was really saying. But then there was one of the greatest quarter horses ever to race at Pompano. Came in, he won at 220. Won at 300 yards. 360, I think. 400 yards. Undefeated, 5 or 6 in a row. And he graduates to the 770, which is starts down the backside around the turn, coming home about 45 seconds. But every night when this horse would race, Hector Van Lennep was the general manager. And he'd call me before the race and he'd say, "Now Roger, be sure you say that horse's name correctly. Don't make any mistakes." Now I can say bull sit, 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 bull sit. I can say it in 20 seconds, I can say it in 30 seconds, I can say it 5 times. Never make a mistake, but everybody downstairs in the grandstand thinks I'm saying something else every once in a while. Pompano decided to bring party groups to the announcer's booth, and most of them were beautiful women. And I'd spend more time talking to them than memorizing the horses. And so I really didn't put these two horses together. 188,000 races. And it's the one race that I didn't finish. Top of the stretch. 1/8 of a mile still to go. What do you say after you say, "That's bullshit on top and scoop it up" is second? Going to the gate at Pompano, Stanley Dancer would always whistle a song. You'd never guess what he'd whistle, but it didn't matter whether it was a trotter or a pacer. See, at Pompano, we're 110 feet in the air, and anything that's down in the winner's circle or on the track, sound goes right straight up, and you can hear it in the judges' stand, announcer's booth, just as clear as a bell. But Dancer would be whistling Winchester Cathedral on every single horse he took to the starting gate. Billy Houghton had white pants on, wore boxers underneath the white pants. Came up a big rain. You know what rain does to the white pants. He had polka dot red boxers underneath and a chance to put the rain pants on. Funniest story though, Pompano Park. Castleton had a company, Castleton Industries had a company known as Time and Tide. They made clocks for boats. And Hector Van Lennep was the head of that company until it went under, and they decided to get out of that. So that Fred Van Lennep, who owned the track, and Dick Wilson, the general manager, had to find a job for Hector. So they brought him into Pompano to be the assistant general manager. I doubt that any of you in the room have ever known Hector Van Lennep. But his first duty as the fire protection was from the North Andrews Volunteer Fire Department. So Hector's first job was to go through the entire facility and find fire traps, anything that would need to be straightened out. And maybe, I don't even know if any of you have ever been upstairs in the announcer's booth and the judges stand, but it's above the clubhouse, most beautiful clubhouse in the world. 6 tiers, dining, everything's pink. Fred Van Lennep and Mrs. Van Lennep are having dinner down on their table on the glass, along with the governor and his wife of the state of Florida. And Fred knew that Hector was looking for fire traps and things like that. We also had a gentleman that worked the press box, sending out the results by lithograph or something, I don't know, something typing machine, I don't know what it's called, by the name of Howie Blyer, who worked for the Miami newspaper but sent out the results at Pompano at night. And Howie was a degenerate gambler. He would bet his last dollar on a horse race. And he'd occasionally hear something, and he was down one night to $6. And he's got to bet this horse. Now, Pompano, as I said, the press box and everything's up above the clubhouse. And there's a false ceiling, which means it's not very strong. And dust galore had built up over the years. When Pompano opened, they never cleaned it or anything. This was one of the fire hazards that Hector was looking for. Howie comes vaulting out of the judge's stand, and it's a cement walkway with a metal railing on each side. And then, of course, 5 or 6 feet down is this false ceiling. Howie drops the $5 bill of his 6 onto that false ceiling. He puts both hands on the railing and vaults over it into the false ceiling. All of a sudden, smoke or dust, it was dust, it wasn't smoke, fills the clubhouse at Pompano Park. Fred says, and all you could see was Howie's legs coming out of the ceiling, and he landed on the shoulders of one of the maitre d's at the desk. Ended up a lawsuit, and the maitre d' collected several $100,000 for getting injured. But Fred looked up there and he said, "Oh my God, it's Hector." Well, it wasn't Hector, it was Howie Blyer. But that was wild. The other funniest story, and then you can ask any questions you want, has nothing to do with harness racing. But at Wilmington College, I was the manager of the basketball team as a freshman, and then I became sports information director and actually replaced Roger Vickroy, who is Barry's uncle, I believe, at Wilmington College. And when I left Wilmington College, Bill Lowe, the little brown jug, replaced me at Wilmington College. I just throw that in. Seems like Wilmington College has quite a few of us. But anyway, we're playing in Berea, Kentucky. And in those days, Wilmington, a small school, we went by automobile, 3 autos, and the roads were horrible. And the lead car got involved in an accident, serious accident, and 4 of our 5 starters were in that lead car, and they got injured, but nothing serious. But they couldn't play basketball that night. So Roger Vickroy, who was the sports information director, actually dressed and jumped center that night for Wilmington. Part of my duties was to lock the dressing room before going upstairs to do the scorebook. So I'm sitting upstairs and they play the national anthem. I looked over and the coach wasn't there yet, Fred Risk. I thought, what's going on? I mean, where's the coach at? About that time, a little boy about 12, 13 years old comes running. Mister, there's somebody down there in your dressing room just beating on the door saying, let me out, let me out, let me out. He'd gone to the bathroom and I'd locked the door and gone on upstairs. When he came upstairs, the look he gave me, I better not face him for a few weeks. He madder than heck. But the college had a newspaper clipping service. And the headline on 180 newspapers worldwide, who needs a basketball coach? Well, he changed his mind because Fred Risk all of a sudden got a lot of publicity because I locked him in the dressing room. I'll talk tonight about my 4 biggest races, which will probably shock a few people. A couple jugs and some other races. Tell you the behind the scenes stories on some of them. We're going to do that tonight. But if anybody's got any questions, fire away because we've still got a few minutes. Way back now, as loud as you can because I got hearing aids and they're not the greatest.
Roger, I'm one of the, I'm sure there's tens of thousands. In fact, I got shivers right now just thinking about your call on Falcon Sealster at the Little Brown Jug.
That's tonight. You'll all be here tonight, but that is probably the #1 race that I'm known for, believe it or not. It was a $6,000 race.
When I first read on the USTA website that you were coming here, I'm sitting on my couch, and the person that's in the room with me says, "What are you reading?" Because I was goosebumps. And I says, "I'm going to show you." I says, "Roger Houston's coming to our banquet, and I'm going to show you what I remember and what's giving me goosebumps." And I brought up that call on YouTube of the Stand on Your Feet, you know, and it's, I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of horsemen that get those same goosebumps for that call.
There's only one race that I'm probably known better for, but that's in Australia. But that call was not thought of ahead of time. That was the thing that harness racing had hanging on its shoulders in those days. They weren't that exciting, you know, and people just sit there on their hands watching the races and they don't get excited. And it wasn't planned, but I never even thought of it. I threw that right in there. It probably is the #1 race played on YouTube. But the wildest race that I ever called was in Adelaide, Australia. Went down there for the Inter-Dominion, and this was one of the undercard that night. Believe it or not, they had 35,000 people there that night, and you can get it on YouTube to this day. And a lot of people throw it up to me because I think it was a field of 12. They had hub rails in those days, and one of my favorite lines, I'm tracks that had hub rails. If I thought a horse was going to win and he was boxed in, and I would say, and so-and-so's nailed to the rail. I can't say nailed to the pylons now, but locked in jail or something like that. He said, but I chose the wrong horse to use it in Australia. As I said, it's the Messiah! Nailed to the It's on YouTube. Can't get rid of them. That was another thing, talk about Australia. I drove in a race down there. I think it was 12 in the race, and I finished fourth, which I was happy. Finished fourth. And if we had race bikes like they have in Australia, I'd probably still be driving in amateur races now. But because they're almost like a jog cart. And they have mud aprons on every race bike. The mud aprons are not to keep the mud from coming up and hitting the driver. That's not what they're for. They have everything known to mankind for a horse, whether it be earplugs that you can pop, whether it be blinders that you can pull a cord and the blinder drop. They even have a rope that comes back. You pull the rope, you have a tight hobble at the start of the race, and after about a 1/16 of a mile, you pull the rope and the hobbles get longer. I couldn't remember which rope to pull. So back here, they took a black felt mark, which is this one you do at the 8th pull, this one you do at the half, and told me what to do. But that was my one drive over there. Another wild one was, I had a horse that I drove in amateur races by the name of Arndal, and she was a typical Arndal. Grab a hold no matter what. The leading driver at that time, well, no, I guess Palone might have been the leading driver at the Meadows, but Doug Snyder, who had been the leading driver until Palone started driving, drove her, and every time Doug drove her, she made a break. Every time Ed Ryan, the home builder, Ryan Holmes drove her, she'd make a break. And the only one she'd stay flat for was me. So I won several races with her in the States and the amateurs and stuff. I wanted to race her at Delaware one year, and they said, oh no, she's got a late closer at Northfield going for 20,000 or something like that. Doug's going to race her at Northfield. Well, she made a break. So I had her at Delaware. Ed would have at least had $5,000 of money, because I think the amateur that year went for like 10,000 at Delaware. I go to Sweden. And it wasn't Solvala, but it was Oxvala, a smaller track. And the guy says, you want to drive your old horse? And I says, what are you talking about? The night of the March of Dimes at Garden State, I think I finished 3rd or 4th with her in the amateur. The Russian run into me going into the first quarter. And she made a break, and we came back, still finished 4th. And Ed Ryan sold her after the race for $47,000. I don't know, it was pretty good money in those days, because I'm not sure what the year was for the March of Dimes. So anyway, I'm in Sweden, and they said, you want to drive her? And I said, well, yeah, I'll drive her. I didn't know the rule in Sweden, should have, but it didn't. If anybody's off stride, they have a recall, always. And 4 or 5 of us evidently didn't know about the recall. We raced like 3/8 of a mile before we realized it was just 4 of us out of the field of 10, so we pulled up. Anyway, we ended up finishing 4th with her that day too. But, I always felt I was a real good driver, and the reason was because I announced 100,000 races or whatever it was at that point in time. And theoretically, an announcer is driving every single race. I know before before a driver makes a move, I think I know what he's going to do beforehand, which reminds me of a jug story. Horse was goalie Jeff, Mike LaChance, owned by the Center Ice Stable, and he wins the jug. That night at the Holiday Inn, they had the victory party. And the guy with the Center Ice Stable came up to me and he says, I think I should write you a check. And I said, what? He says, for telling Mike LaChance what to do. I said, what are you talking about? I don't remember what I say in race calls. He said, well, you told him when to pull. Well, if you remember that race, goalie Jeff was, I think, like third over with cover, past the half, and right in front of the paddock, I noticed that the nose of goalie Jeff is all of a sudden on the driver's shoulder. Hadn't come out yet, and I make the call. And Mike LaChance better come now! He came out. I knew he was coming out. Anyway, the other one to give me part of the verse.
Roger, I'd
Yeah.
like to have you make a few comments. You were the mentor of Sam McKee while you raced ball time. Could you just refresh some of your thoughts about Sam?
I get broke up when I was talking about those blind guys. You really want to break me up now, huh? Sam McKee. I got one vote one time for Horseman of the Year. Sam McKee, at the age of 6, voted for me because that was his first job. And like Atkins, who was blind, Sam just, after his mom and dad, at the age of 6, I'm going to be an announcer. I'm going to be an announcer. I'm in Florida. He's in Linden, Michigan. He'd write me a letter. I'd answer him. I'd get a letter back in 2 days. He was just like that. Bugged the living daylights out of me. But the most important thing in the world, this is off of Sam. Somebody comes up to you and say, I want to be a driver. Don't ever brush that youngster off, because you never know who you're talking to. And Sam, at the age of 7, 8, 9, I never brushed him off. I finally moved to Pennsylvania in '76, and by that time he was sending me tapes, calling races, back row of the grandstand. Want me to critique him. That's another thing I never believed in. I've helped probably 34 announcers, one way or the other, get started in the business. And he was one of them. And I said, well, why don't you come down and visit with us for a week? Now we're living in Pennsylvania. 3 days later, he'd hitchhiked. He knew the people he was hitchhiking with. So he did qualifiers, I think, at the age of 14. He was super. I called Bobby Williams. He was a general farm manager for Fairmead or Green Acres or something like that at Wilmington, Ohio. And it was where I had started. I told Bobby, I says, have you got an announcer yet this year? He said, oh, you coming? I said, no, not me, but I got an announcer for you. Well, who is it? And I said, oh, you don't know him, but his name's Sam McKee. Well, how much do I have to pay? I said, $50 a night. I says, you don't have to worry about expenses because he'll probably stay with my in-laws who lived in Wilmington. I says, you'll get so much publicity out of this kid, it'll be pitiful because he's only 14. I'm not paying any 14-year-old $50 a night to announce horse races. You know, horse races, announce the jug. That's all I had to do. I probably cried more the day that he had the stroke than I did when my own dad died. It's horrible to say. I had to speak at his funeral. Phil Terry was the marketing director. He drove and I rode with him. Phil said, the time we got to New Jersey, that he could have done the eulogy because all the way up there I'm reading what I'm going to say over and over and over and over, but that's the only way you can do it without crying for me. And I'll bet you for the first year after he died, whether it be at the half, whether it be at the 3/4, somewhere in that race or that day, I just think of Sammy. And what makes me so mad, I think Sam would have still been alive today if he had gone and seen the right doctor. Because the untold story was his one daughter had a stroke. And then he found out that she had a hole in her heart. So they checked the other daughter. And she had a hole in her heart, and they repaired it. They never once checked Chris or Sammy. Sammy had a hole in his heart. And I think because he went to the wrong doctor, that's why he died at the age of 54. And I'll always believe that. And there's so many other stories that, when I was a kid growing up, we had a ping pong table, and I made a racetrack out of a deck of cards. And I had little horses that I made tape, put it over their back as a saddle pad, a number of 1 through 12. Shake the dice, and they'd go, if they got a 6, they'd go 4 up, and then you had to go to the outside, there's 5, 1 leg up, 6, do that. I didn't know, but Sam did the same thing when he was growing up. There were so many similarities between the two of us. I didn't find that one out until I think it was the day of the funeral. It's the hardest thing I ever had to face that day. And everybody kept saying they knew they wanted him to come back, but I knew he couldn't come back. It was hard. Change the subject, please. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you do to prep yourself for a race from when you started out to now?
Oh, when I started out, it was 4 or 5 minutes. I just got to throw names in. Dave Malone, one, name of the horse. Name of the horse, number 1, Dave Malone. Number 2, Tony Hall, name of the horse. Did that 3 or 4 times in a 4 or 5 minute period before the race started. Now I'm talking back in the 60s and 70s. But then when I went to Pompano, did the quarter horses and stuff, and they started bringing the party groups up there, I realized I almost had instant memorization. And I don't even do that. The only thing that I do is 3 days before the races, I do the morning line, things like that. But and I knew most of the names to begin with. But, the post parade would be the first time I'd look at the horses, and because we were doing a live TV show, I wasn't studying horses or anything like that. So that I don't have to do anymore. Now, I still do it on the jug, believe me, because they got those no-count saddle pads. They're little brown jet pads. Kind of strip down at the bottom, says the horse's name and all that stuff. You've got to memorize those horses. They're easy because of big time drivers and stuff like that. That makes it a lot easier. And memorize the adios, of course, in the big races. I also did thoroughbreds. That's something I didn't mention, but for a month and a half, I did Calder in the afternoon and Pompano at night because announcer Calder got laryngitis. And I says, I'm not going to change the way I announce races. I'm going to announce it just like a harness race. Everybody, I can remember them down the rail looking up what the announcers were doing. What's this guy? But after about 2 weeks or so, they got kind of used to it. And Bob Savage was the announcer. He said when he came back, people said, why'd you come back? So,
Well, don't some of the announcers use colors or crayons or whatever?
yeah, and I don't know why they do that. I mean, I know why they do it. It helps them memorize and stuff, but I've never done it. It is so easy for an announcer today to announce horse races compared to the days when everybody in the first race had red saddle pads. The second race had blue saddle pads. But now they got, the one horse has a red, the two has a blue, the three has a white. I can't even remember now. But once they did that, it's so easy to memorize that it's pitiful. So they made the announcer's job a lot easier. But that was put into effect for simulcast viewers. And when we started out, and this was big, the thoroughbreds had one color group, and harness had a different set of 1 through 10. But now then, after about 2 or 3 years, they got together and they're identical next door. So it's easy now with the pads.
Did Charlie Hinkle get killed in the trade wreck?
Did he what?
Did Charlie Hinkle get killed in the car at the train
No.
accident?
No. Not natural. Charlie, my famous Charlie story, we're both from Xenia, Ohio, believe it or not. And in 1960, my very first year, Charlie went to the Urbana Fair Board and says, I'd like to announce the races on Tuesday and Wednesday for the Champaign and Buckeye Futurities. And I can get the races on WBLY in Springfield. Junior Luce, who was the speed superintendent, came to me on Monday and said, you'll get your pay, but go up there and sit in the grandstand with Martin. You'll get paid, but the fair board can't turn down being on WBLY radio. I went home that night and went right to Uncle Don's house. I says, what do you do? And he says, you can't do nothing. He says, you're just going to have to live with it, but your day will come. I can remember my Uncle Don saying, your day will come.
Well, your uncle was a non-announcer, wasn't
So Tuesday, races are supposed to be on BLY. I'm sitting in the grandstand. Charlie 125 is not there. They're supposed to post parade. Junior Luce, who had hired me and told me, paged me to come to the infield judges stand. He says, Charlie's didn't show up. Get the horses out, parade them, you were calling today. Got them out on the track. They're scoring. And I looked over and here comes Charlie, hot-footing it across the infield. Just not running, but as fast as he could walk. But he made one big mistake. And it was a mistake, and Charlie and I go back a long way, but he had a serious problem. They had a stage. He put his briefcase on the stage, opened it up, took out his flask, took about 3 or 4 big swigs, put the flask back in, shut the briefcase, come up the stairs, run over to me, grabbed the microphone out of my hand, he says, "I'll take it over from here." Junior Luce walked up to him, grabbed the microphone out of his hand, he says, "No, Roger's calling the races today." By the way, I don't hold ill feelings because I'm the one that nominated him for the Immortal Hall of Fame. And he went into the Immortal Hall of Fame last year because Charlie Hinkle probably did more for harness racing in the 40s and the 50s than any other human being. Got him on ABC, NBC, CBS, and all the stations. Hamiltonian, and everything. And I'm probably halfway Charlie Hinkle, halfway Uncle Don. I was in between both of them. Funniest story on Charlie, he was, believe it or not, he was the announcer at the Meadows in '75 when they told him that Roger was going to replace him. He called me every night from the Red Bull Inn, a few drinks under his belt, begging me not to take the job at the Meadows, but I took it. The most famous story of Charlie, every night as soon as the race was over, he'd make a beeline for the Red Bull Inn. Bartender would have his drink right there on the bar. He'd been there about 5 or 6 minutes, and somebody came in and says, "Who owns that white so-and-so car out in the parking lot?" Charlie said, "Well, that's mine." He said, "Well, you forgot to put it in park, and the engine was running, and it went down over the hill." There's a fog race where they had fog settled in, and Charlie decided he was going to recreate or something, or tell the folks in the grandstand how the race would go once they came to the track. So he announced a fake race. The mutual tellers downstairs all of a sudden realized the mutual windows were still open. And they're punching tickets because Charlie's got this horse on top by 10 lengths. The trainer is walking the horse up the hill at the Meadows going back to the barn because they had canceled the races. I think they bet extra $10,000 in that race. Any others?
Roger,
Yeah.
over here.
Yeah.
Aside from the speed at the Brown Jug, what changes have you seen?
They got rid of the hub rail. It's an all-weather track. I like to shock audiences when I speak. I haven't shocked you, I don't think, with anything I've said. But the worst thing that has ever happened to harness racing is the catch driver. Totally changed everything. Now, I don't totally agree with that, but usually when I speak and I make that statement, something like that I've done. One time I went to Truro, Nova Scotia, announce races and speak at their horseman's banquet. And somebody in the audience says, "What do you think of Some Beach Somewhere?" I said, "Who?" They said, "Some Beach Somewhere." I said, "Did he race in the jug?" The guy said, "No." I said, well, that's why I've never heard of him. After the dinner was over and everything, the guy comes up to me and he says, "By the way, I own a part of Some Beach Somewhere." Hub rail, all-weather track. The reason it's an all-weather track, how many of you heard of Charles Juravinsky, owner of Flamborough Downs? He had a horse in the jug. He hired a private jet and brought 25 of his friends with him to the jug. We got rained out on Thursday and postponed the race to Friday. Charlie was livid, because he had to take that jet back and couldn't come back and get the jet the next day, so he missed his horse racing in the jug. And next year, it was an all-weather track. I remember 1 year before, it was an all-weather track. The grader into the first turn where that pavilion 10 is now, I can see that grader yet. It's out in about the 4 or 5 horse position, and all of a sudden, it's in the 3 horse, it's in the 2 horse, it's at the rail, and it takes out about 20 yards of hub rail. That was a slick son of a gun when you did it. I can see Curly Smart going out on the racetrack yet. He going like this with his foot, you know. We'll race at 1 o'clock. Who was the first driver to wear white pants in the Little Brown Jug? I'm having a senior moment. Jim Dennis, first driver. And how do I know? I had all the tapes of the Little Brown Jug, and I watched every one of them from 1946 right up. And Jim Dennis was the first guy in the post parade that had white pants on. We're over on time. Any other questions? Fire away. Yeah.
Roger, you want to test your 50-year-old memory?
A 50-year-old memory?
Yeah, you want to test 50 years ago, Pompano
What year
Park.
would that be?
Pardon?
What year would that be?
1970.
1970, okay.
Pompano Park.
Pompano Park.
Young trainer for Del Miller. He's driving a horse called Horace Hanover, and he wins and pays $83.60. Well, that was me. 50 years ago.
I wish I could say,
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect.
multiply this in your head. 188,000 races times 8.
Yeah,
Maybe 7 would be the average. That would be 700, that would be 1,300,000
yeah.
horses
Now,
names.
and in the quarter horse races and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, in your book, you talk about Pompano being the place to be, you know, in those days.
In
Well,
those days, it was.
It definitely was. I mean, I was there for 5 years in the late 60s and early 70s.
Have you been there lately?
Well, you know, from what I hear, it makes me cry.
It really hurts to see what it was and now. That beautiful grandstand, glass, all the glasses fell out of the clubhouse now. Whether this will be the last year for Pompano or one more year, I don't know. You get different stories from various people. Whether this is the last year of Pompano, but it is very hard for me to go to Pompano remembering what it was. And, you know,
If I remember right, you and your wife, there was either a Denny's or an IHOP restaurant. IHOP. When you and your wife would go after the races, after the races, and
that would have been 1967, 68 for sure.
Yeah.
Would you say it was 70?
well, 70 is when I won some races driving for Delvin. But I was
What's your name?
Bob Jan. But,
Yes, I do remember. I remember the horse. You know,
but 68 and 69, 68 I was working for Billy Houghton and 69 for Delvin, and that would have been when, after the races, we'd go for pancakes and you and your wife would be there.
my first wife.
Oh.
No woman is capable of living with me. Luckily, and I said this in the book, and if you read it, I dedicated the book to my daughter. She has put up with me for so many things because, I almost hate to admit this because it's horrible. Racing came first.
Well, I think you'll find there's an awful lot of horsemen that's the same way, that racing came first and then caused a lot of divorces and so forth, so it's, but as you say, those were greatest possible years possible for the sport and everything else.
All righty, Roger, we have time for just one more question, and then we'll have to take our break.
This is a $64,000 question.
I have one comment I'd like to make about Bob. He was one of the first drivers that Bill had behind the great Delmarva Hanover.
Yep. Would that have been in Pompano?
No, not at Pompano. I drove her to Atlantic City when she was a 2-year-old, and I drove her in like 1970 or 71 at the Meadows and set the then track record with her. And of course, she went on to be Horse of the Year. And
I did an in-depth interview, lasted 3.5 hours, with Mary Liv. I wish that we'd have done it with Delvin, but we never, it was after his death. And I did it with Mary Liv. You know, she was petrified every time Delvin drove. That she and Ann Ryan, Ed Ryan's wife,
yeah.
whenever they would drive, at least this was at the Meadows, they would go to the ladies' restroom while the race was on. Tremendous story with Mary Liv. I did her funeral too.
When I was working with Delvin, Mary Liv could never remember my name, but she would refer to me as that good-looking kid, you know, that works for Delvin.
She would, I don't think she knew my first name. She honey. All right, 4 biggest races.
All right, thank you, Roger. Roger will be speaking tonight at our banquet. Let's give a round of applause for Roger. Thank you, Roger. All righty, Danny?
No, I got nothing else. Thanks, everyone, for this afternoon. We'll clear out the room and then look forward to seeing everyone at the dinner.